Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So let's continue with 4 MRA arguments that actually have a point and where they go wrong by Susanna Wise. And we're finally up to the 3rd argument she makes, which is 3. Circumcision is a violation of bodily autonomy.
Some men's rights activists also talk about circumcision as unjust treatment of people with penises. Once again, many feminists agree on this.
Well, some feminists are against it, some aren't, and many dismiss it. But let's continue.
Part of creating a culture of consent is not doing anything to anyone's body without their permission, and that includes circumcision.
I would actually agree with this, but before going through the rest of Susanna's argument, let's have a look at her citation. It's an article I want to spend a bit of time on. It's called How Men's Rights Activists Hijacked the Circumcision Debate. Now, there are 2 things I want you to take note of in this article. 1, she starts off by making some really good points against circumcision and then shifts the focus of the article to women being abused online, which is obviously the bigger issue, right? I can't think why we would ever criticize feminists when it comes to circumcision when they do things like this. This is what they typically call derailing. And the second thing I want you to look out for is she has a very interesting way of defining MRAs. Basically, judging by this article, in her opinion, an MRA is someone abusive towards women online, and that's about it. Nothing more complex than that is needed, it seems. So anyone who's an abusive asshole towards a woman online, hey, that's an MRA according to this feminist author.
It's much easier to demonize and create an enemy than hear out a reasonable position. That might distract from the victim narrative.
Hey, it's Little Miss Anonymous. Thanks for stopping by and helping out with the video.
Thanks for having me, Bane.
You are always welcome, Anon. But anyway, let's get stuck into the article.
Everyone should have control over their own body, including, or maybe especially, their genitalia. That seems like a pretty standard feminist tenet. So how did the Activist movement, which argues that routine infant circumcision is a violation of this consent, wind up with followers who spit bile like feminist chauvinist sours? They can drop dead?
You'll note there is no citation for the example she gives at the end. In other words, she just made it up to create a stereotype. Now, are there people on the internet who say this type of shit? Sure, of course there is. Just like there are feminists who openly say hate-filled and bigoted things. And of course, this isn't limited to just anti-feminists, MRAs and feminists. It's the internet in general, with a small number from just about any group being abusive dickheads. But she's trying to paint a picture here of MRAs being abusive assholes on the internet, and this is something we will see more of throughout the article. Next.
On paper, Activism is a legitimate human rights effort to end routine infant circumcision. But in fact, many branches of the movement have become sinister and downright ugly, because men's rights activists, MRA, have hijacked the cause as part of their mission.
Hijacked? How exactly have MRAs hijacked the activist movement? I find feminist hypocrisy amusing. On one hand, they claim that we never talk about actual men's rights issues. Of course, they always use non-MRAs as examples. And on the other hand, they claim that we are hijacking men's issues when actual MRAs talk about actual issues. So we can't win in their eyes because the game is rigged. But what exactly have feminists done to stop male circumcision? They've had control of the gender debate for 40 years now. What exactly have they done other than tell us that it's not as harmful as FGM, therefore not as important, as opposed to, campaigning against all forms of genital mutilation, right?
Their main concern seems to be to solve 100% of women's issues first and then create some more so we never get to address men's issues.
It's interesting you say that. Solving all women's issues first, then men's issues would magically be solved used to be one of their main arguments. I'm hearing it less often these days as we've gained ground and they now have to acknowledge that men's issues are important too. Well, that is, acknowledge them and then try to dismiss them, as we see in this article. And they seem to be more concerned about things like manspreading than male infant circumcision. Priorities, right guys? But let's continue.
The MRA-fueled rhetoric is a bizarre amalgamation of sexist slurs paired with carefully calculated and co-opted feminist language surrounding body autonomy and consent.
And of course she doesn't give us a single example of an actual MRA doing this.
Even if she did manage to find a couple of examples, so what? Every movement has its assholes being assholes. The base premise here is not to violate someone's rights to an intact body. How could a handful of idiots ruin that message? If the hateful feminists don't ruin feminism, why would the hateful MRAs ruin the men's rights movement?
Hashtag not all feminists. Next.
According to World Health Organization estimates, 30% of the world population of men over the age of 15 are circumcised, most of them for religious reasons. In the United States, the rate is much higher. While rates have been declining, around 55 to 60% of assigned male at birth, AMAB, infants are still circumcised.
Okay, I'm a supporter of trans rights, but do we really need to use terms like assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth? Can't we just say boy or girl? Now, if that boy or girl grows up to be trans, that's fantastic. Everyone should support their rights and be accepting, no argument there. But terms like assigned male at birth is just word policing bullshit used by people who are virtue signalling how woke they are and to show how better they are than those who don't use such terms. Mark my words, if everyone started using that term tomorrow, suddenly it wouldn't be good enough, and they'd come up with yet another term to separate them from the unenlightened masses.
We don't assign a gender, we identify as sex. Bloody hell.
And here, most circumcisions are performed for cultural reasons, because circumcised penises are culturally viewed as cleaner, or more normal, or because parents simply haven't considered the alternative. The American Academy of Pediatrics, AAP, in their 2012 policy statement, stopped short of recommending routine infant circumcision, but they did say that the benefits of elective circumcision of newborn AMAB infants outweigh the risks of the procedure. The AAP cites benefits like reduced risk of urinary tract infections and reduced risks of STIs, including HIV, in those who are circumcised.
Okay, so I said she does make some good arguments against male circumcision. These aren't those arguments. Urinary tract infections are easily cured without amputating part of someone's body. We don't cure a broken arm by amputating the arm. We don't prevent appendicitis by mandatory removal of the appendix in newborn babies. As for the HIV nonsense, this comes from a flawed study in Africa where adult men were circumcised and instructed not to have unprotected sex for 6 weeks after the operation, unlike the uncircumcised control group. The circumcised group were actually given condoms and shown how to use them for that 6-week period. So comparing two different groups with different levels of exposure is not good science. Also, other evidence shows that 8 out of 18 countries in Africa, circumcised men have lower rates of HIV, while in the remaining 10 in the survey, they have higher rates. So there is no compelling evidence that males being circumcised lowers HIV transmissions. In fact, there is an argument that it increases it. Let's play devil's advocate for a moment and say that the flawed African study is, in fact, 100% correct. In this case, it only lowers the rates of transmission to men, not their female partners. And if circumcised men believe they are less likely to contract AIDS, then they are less likely to use condoms. So this HIV prevention myth is in fact more likely to increase the spread of AIDS, at very least amongst females, and that's giving those who believe the myth the best case scenario. Of course, we could just increase education about safe sex, right? That's far more effective than amputating part of a newborn's body. There are a couple of other factors to consider as well. The US has the highest rate of HIV infection in the West, but also the highest rate of circumcised men, so it doesn't seem to have had an effect there. And if we are talking about circumcision in Africa, then it's often done under unhygienic conditions, which could actually help spread it. But, some American doctors are making a bundle out of it, so I guess that's all that really counts, right?
Even if amputating a healthy part of a man's genitals somehow prevented HIV, which, as Bain already pointed out, it fucking doesn't, what infant is having sex? It's still wrong to strap down a newborn and amputate a part of their bodies. Funnily enough, babies have contracted herpes during some circumcisions done in the Jewish community.
Intactivists aren't all MRAs, by any means. They come in all stripes. Many parents, birth educators, doulas, and advocates for body autonomy are in favor of ending the practice of routine infant circumcision.
This is in fact true. Male circumcision is a men's rights issue, but you can be against it without identifying as an MRA or agreeing with MRAs on any other issues. In fact, I suspect many intactivists wouldn't even know what MRA stands for. But later she will go on to claim that the intactivists she doesn't like are MRAs simply because she doesn't like them, while the good intactivists aren't. Next.
And there are plenty of individuals and collective groups doing good work to consciously and compassionately educate parents about the downsides of circumcision and the benefits of leaving genitals intact. Mostly, intactivist arguments hinge on body autonomy, the idea that it is a human rights violation to have a highly sensitive and healthy body part amputated without medical indication and without consent. In regards to the benefits touted by the AAP, intactivists argue that proper education about how to care for intact penises and sexual education would go just as far, or further, in reducing risks of infection in cisgender boys and men. As a parent to intact children, and as a former childbirth educator and birth doula, I can attest to the widespread misinformation and misunderstanding of the functions of the foreskin. Medical professionals should be educated about the functions of the foreskin and how to care for an intact penis. Many are not. This means parents don't have complete information when choosing whether to circumcise, and furthermore, the misunderstandings may actually be the cause of the higher instances of UTIs and other foreskin problems among uncircumcised cis boys.
Okay, credit where credit is due. She makes some good arguments here. Let's continue.
But it's harder for people like me to argue for rethinking routine circumcision when the movement is full of anti-feminist hate.
I guess it would also be harder for women's rights activists to argue for women's rights when the feminist movement is filled with anti-male hate, right? Funny, I can't imagine she'd agree with that. Next.
Intactivist extremism. MRAs and their allies are anti-circumcision zealots who operate as extremists within the intactivist movement. This branch's online, educational efforts, and protest are defined by the vicious harassment of healthcare providers and mothers.
Okay, so bad men say nasty things to some mothers on the internet, therefore they must hate women, therefore they are MRAs in her logic, And we'll see this throughout the rest of the article as well.
Wait, are you not supposed to be a zealot when people are mutilating babies' genitals?
If you ever see an anti-activist extremist protest, it's hard not to draw the correlation between their efforts and anti-abortion demonstrations. Dressed all in white, their crotches stained with bright red blood, anti-activists hold up graphic posters of screaming babies and bloody penises.
Okay, so it's pretty clear she is talking about the bloodstained men and their friends here. To my knowledge, they do not identify as MRAs. They might not have even heard of the term, nor do they advocate for other men's issues. Nor are they, to my knowledge, anti-feminist. Now, there may be individuals within the group who are either anti-feminist or MRAs, just as there could be feminists amongst them. We don't know. But she's going to use them as an example of MRAs because she doesn't like them or their methods. Personally, I don't have an issue with their protests. They definitely are a lot less harmful than violating a newborn's bodily integrity, which should be the real issue here. And in case you haven't noticed, we are now in the 21st century and male circumcision is still legal. What's wrong with stirring the pot to get things done? But you should have noticed that she compares them to anti-abortion protesters to try to create the impression that these are the bad men, when in reality the bloodstained men and their friends have no connection to anything which is anti-abortion. She does this dirty trick later on as well.
The major difference between these men and anti-abortion lobbyists is that these men are not using dishonest tactics. They are wounded, they have been robbed, and they are suffering. Anti-abortionists rely entirely on the shock value of late-term abortions that are rarely performed. Every man that was circumcised at birth was robbed of something.
Other visual props included a stop sign placard that reads, "Stop cutting babies," a clear echo of the iconic, "Stop abortion now," signs that have become a hallmark of anti-abortion protests. Other signs read, "Circumcision is a sex crime," and "Sex abusers for hire."
Talk about fucking clutching at straws. So because the bloodstained men have a sign saying, "Stop cutting babies," that somehow makes them like anti-abortionists because they also have signs with the word "stop" in it. Wow. You know what other group uses the word "stop"? Go on, have a guess. Go on. I dare you to think what other group might go to protests with the word "stop" on their signs. I guess now we can conclude that feminists are just like anti-abortionists, right? Feminist logic for the win. Next.
Like anti-abortion extremists, who frame their argument around the idea that abortion is murder, anti-activist extremists contextualize circumcision as a sex crime to motivate a vigilante-style roundup of criminals.
What absolute monsters. How dare they think the violation of newborn baby boys and their basic human rights is a crime. Just pure fucking monsters, clearly.
I'm fucking sorry, but forcefully cutting off parts of newborns' sex organs isn't a sex crime. How?
I agree. Next.
Oddly, while mirroring tactics of the extreme right, they simultaneously co-opt marginalized narratives for their own ends. Phrases like, "gender equality begins at birth," and "his penis, his choice," mimicking feminist slogans, can also be found sprinkled amongst anti-activist protest signs.
You'll note that she hasn't actually made any connection to the extreme right or even the right in general. Her only argument is they use the word "stop" on their signs. Wow, staggering in-depth analysis here. So once she's just made up a connection where there isn't one, she then dismisses any connection to the left or feminism by claiming it's mimicking feminist slogans. Now, I have no idea of the political leanings of the blood-stained men and their friends. Most likely it's varied, but I suspect that many of them lean to the left. That is, if I had to guess. Next.
Extremist demonstrators accost physicians at medical conferences and at hospitals and follow them around with cameras, screaming, "Penis butcher." They take video of this harassment and post it proudly on the internet, Operation Rescue style.
And you know what? I don't have an issue with that, as long as they don't physically assault them or block their entry.
I suggest people watch some YouTube videos of their protests and judge for themselves. I've seen more attempts at calm dialogue than screaming matches.
We don't want men with uncut penises. That's gross.
Oh no.
I want pictures.
You said something about uncut penises being
No,
gross?
No, it is.
What about uncut vulvas? Are they gross too?
Wait! Sorry. Do you understand? Sorry. We didn't hear you.
Maybe what's good for the goose is good for the other goose?
No.
That's just ridiculous.
That's just ridiculous,
It
but
is
I'm not
so
going to argue
ridiculous.
with him.
What's ridiculous, sir?
Everything you're doing. I
What,
mean,
I'm
you know,
videotaping a protest.
well,
How is it ridiculous?
because males don't feel any or suffer any trauma.
Really?
Really.
And what about those children that have lost their penises or their lives? Do you know the story of David Reimer?
No, I don't.
You should look it up.
No, thank you.
Some baby boys have been made into girls because
I
of this.
don't think you're speaking with a full set of facts.
I got all the facts, sir.
But doctors aren't the only targets. You'll also find activist extremists harassing mothers, both at public protests and online. And when they're dealing with women, their vitriol gets even grosser.
And here we come to her main issue. Not that babies are having their rights violated, but that the bad men are saying nasty things to women online. Yeah, you got to focus on those priorities, right? Next.
Online bullies. For activist extremists, online activism largely consists of stealing personal social media posts, including pictures of infants, and subjecting the unsuspecting parents, usually mothers, of course, to an onslaught of harassment.
Usually mothers. You'll note she doesn't say only mothers, which means they do this to fathers as well. Now, assuming she is correct about it happening more often to mothers, the question is why? Might it be that mothers are more likely to appear in pictures with their newborns? Nah, it just has to be misogyny, right? It's just because those nasty pseudo-MRAs hate the women's or some bullshit. Who knows?
See you guys next time.
Thanks, Anon, and we'll continue with this article in the next episode.
About a century and a half ago, doctors in America came up with this idea that male circumcision might cure essentially all known diseases, that it could stop masturbation, and masturbation being, at that time it was thought to be a moral problem, it was thought that promoting moral hygiene would also promote health hygiene, and so by circumcising you would then cure, you name it, every disease under the sun. As time marched on, gradually one rationale for circumcision got replaced by another, and that process has continued up to the present day. And so the latest rationale, quote unquote, is HIV, and it is wrong in so many ways, it's hard to even know where to begin. First of all, the HIV epidemic the numbers are already declining. The number of new infections are already declining. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be alarmed about HIV, that it shouldn't be something people are worried about and working on. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that the epidemic is controlling itself through forces that are beyond any one researcher, any one country, any one individual's actions. HIV occurs to adults. Now, of course, infants can be born to infected mothers and can also get it that way. But typically, HIV is transmitted through sexual activity. At least if we're talking about Africa, it's transmitted through sexual activity. It's often transmitted also through use of infected needles, and that can also happen in the US as well. One of the main places you get HIV in Africa is actually at a health clinic, which certainly is not true in the US. So doctors performed these 3 highly flawed studies in Africa, and many of us saw it coming. They tried to then take these studies on adults in Africa and generalize them to infants in the US. So first of all, the US is not Africa, as we've already discussed. Secondly, these are infants who are not going to be sexually active for presumably 15 to 18 years. And to say that you should cut healthy tissue out of an infant to stop possible, highly speculative infection that could possibly happen from sexual activity 15 to 18 years in the future, when there may be other cures for the condition by that point, is just lunacy. And it just boggles the mind that people can even propose this with a straight face, and yet the World Health Organization has lined up behind this. Numerous other organizations have lined up behind this based on the advocacy, and it really is advocacy by first world physicians. And to those of us who have been working to try to protect children for years, this was not out of the blue, but it was just a very disheartening and sad development that we had to observe, and really a hijacking of the HIV issue, which, again, I mean, obviously millions of people throughout the world have suffered seriously and have died from this throughout the years. And to cynically take this and try to use this as a reason to cut perfectly healthy babies in the US is just shocking in its cynicism. It really is. And one can only speculate as to what the next justification is going to be once the HIV myth, and when I say myth, I mean the myth that using circumcision to stop transmission of HIV in the US, when that myth is blown apart, one can only wonder what the next justification for circumcision will be. But we'll find out, because sooner or later we'll disprove the myth that HIV is going to be stopped by circumcising babies.